For 23 years, I walked into the same building through the employee entrance. I parked in the same corner of the garage, greeted the same security guard every morning, and stopped at the same coffee machine before my shift began. Nobody paid much attention to me anymore, and that was exactly how I wanted it. My name tag read *** Claire Dawson ***, Senior Technical Support Specialist. To everyone in the company, I was simply an older employee who had been around forever. What they didn't know was that my real name was Claire Morgan. 23 years earlier, I had founded MorganTech in a rented warehouse with 3 folding tables, 2 computers, and 1 employee who agreed to work for free until we landed our first client. I spent years sleeping in the office, eating instant noodles, and convincing investors that my company could compete with businesses 10 times our size. Eventually we did. MorganTech became one of California's fastest-growing cybersecurity companies. 5 years ago, I sold the majority of my shares to an investment group, but kept 35% of the company and a permanent seat on the board of directors. After my husband passed away, I realized retirement wasn't for me. I miss solving problems. I miss talking to customers. So instead of sitting in board meetings every month, I quietly returned to work under my maiden name. Only the chairman of the board and the head of human resources knew who I really was. Everyone else believed I was just another employee nearing retirement. That Monday morning felt different the moment I stepped into the lobby. A large banner hung above the reception desk. ***, welcome our new CEO, Ryan Brooks ***. Employees stood in small groups whispering excitedly. Some hoped the new CEO would bring promotions. Others worried layoffs were coming. I simply poured myself a cup of coffee and walked toward the support department. At exactly 9 o'clock, every employee received an email ordering us to gather in the main auditorium. Ryan Brooks walked onto the stage wearing an expensive navy suit and the kind of confidence only someone in his 30s could have. He smiled as cameras flashed around him. "I believe companies fail for one simple reason," he began. "People become comfortable. Starting today, comfort is over." The room fell silent. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes about efficiency, performance, and eliminating dead weight. Then he surprised everyone. "I don't need months to know who's holding this company back," he said. "I've already reviewed personnel files." Managers exchanged nervous looks. Ryan stepped off the stage and began walking through the audience. He stopped beside one employee. "Your sales numbers are excellent. Keep it up." Then another. "I like your ideas." Then he stopped in front of me. He glanced at my name tag before looking at my personnel file. "Claire Dawson," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. 61 years old. 23 years with the company. Technical support. He closed the folder. "People like you are the reason companies stop growing." The auditorium became completely silent. Ryan looked towards security. "Please collect Miss Dawson's badge. I don't believe this company is the right place for her anymore." 2 security guards immediately started walking toward me. Neither of them knew. They were about to escort the founder of the company out of her own building. The 2 security guards walked toward me, clearly uncomfortable. One of them, Michael, had worked in the building for nearly 15 years. Every Christmas he brought homemade cookies for the night shift, and every year I asked him how his daughters were doing in college. He stopped a few feet away and sighed before speaking. "Miss Dawson." "I'm sorry." I smiled, unclipped my employee badge, and placed it into his hand. "It's all right," I said. "You're just doing your job." Ryan watched the exchange with a satisfied smile before turning back to the employees. "This is what leadership looks like," he announced. "Difficult decisions. Companies don't grow by protecting people who are no longer useful." Nobody applauded. The room was completely silent. Several employees lowered their eyes while others stared at me, unsure of what to think. I picked up my notebook and the old coffee mug that had been sitting beside my chair. Ryan noticed it immediately. You won't be needing company property anymore. I looked at the mug, then back at him. I bought this before your career even started. A few people nearby exchanged confused glances. Ryan forced a smile but said nothing. I simply turned around and walked toward the exit. As I reached the doors, I heard him speaking again. By Friday, I expect every department manager to submit a list of employees who have become comfortable. MorganTech is entering a new era, and anyone who can't keep up won't be staying. The word stayed with me as I stepped into the California sunshine. Comfortable. 23 years of my life had just been reduced to a single label. 23 years of 16-hour workdays. 23 years of sleeping in the office before product launches. 23 years of risking everything I owned to keep the company alive. And now I was nothing more than dead weight in the eyes of a man who had been CEO for less than 30 minutes. Before I reached my car, my phone rang. The screen displayed a familiar name, *** Harold Bennett ***, chairman of the board. I answered immediately. I just heard, he said without any greeting. His voice was calm, but I could hear the anger underneath. I assume Ryan still doesn't know who you are. No. And you didn't tell him. I wasn't planning to. Harold sighed. The board meeting is Thursday morning. I know. Are you still coming? I looked back at the glass tower that had once existed only as a rough sketch inside my notebook. Of course. There was a long silence before he spoke again. Claire, Ryan isn't actually the reason I called. My hand tightened around the phone. Then what is it? Our auditors found something yesterday. At first we thought it was a bookkeeping mistake, but it wasn't. I stopped walking. What did they find? Harold lowered his voice. Someone has been stealing from MorganTech for years. We estimate nearly $80 million is gone, and whoever is behind it has been covering their tracks almost perfectly. I stared back at the building. Ryan believed he had just fired the weakest employee in the company. What neither of us knew was that somewhere behind those glass windows, the person who had been quietly destroying MorganTech was probably sitting at their desk. Watching everything unfold. Remained in my car long after the call ended, staring at the headquarters that had once been nothing more than an empty warehouse with a leaking roof. Back then, I couldn't afford proper office furniture, so our first desks were old wooden doors balanced on metal filing cabinets. My first employees believed in me when no investor would. We celebrated our first contract with pizza because that was all we could afford, and every dollar we earned went straight back into the business. Looking at the glass tower now, it was almost impossible to believe it had all started with 4 people and a dream. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Harold. ***, don't tell anyone you're coming, Thursday, 9:00 a.m. ***, nothing else. No explanation. That wasn't like Harold. If he was being this careful, the situation had to be worse than he had admitted over the phone. I started the engine but didn't drive home. Instead, I headed toward a small cafe across the street from MorganTech. It had been there longer than the company itself. The owner still remembered me from the days when I'd buy the cheapest coffee on the menu and spend hours sketching business plans on paper napkins. I sat by the window where I could see the main entrance. Employees came and went as if nothing had happened. Ryan walked out just after noon, surrounded by department managers. He laughed confidently while pointing toward the building, already acting as if he owned every brick. None of them noticed the black SUV parked across the street. 2 men in suits stepped out, showed their badges to reception, and disappeared inside. They weren't police officers. They were forensic accountants hired by the board, and almost nobody knew they were coming. Almost an hour later, Harold called again. "They're already inside," he said quietly. "Ryan has no idea." I frowned. "You didn't tell the CEO?" "No. We don't know who we can trust yet." My heartbeat slowed. Harold wasn't exaggerating anymore. He was scared. Claire, there's something else. I waited. The money wasn't transferred to one account. It was split into dozens of companies over 3 years. Shell companies. Exactly. Who approved the contracts? There was another pause. That's the problem. Every approval carries a valid executive signature. I looked back at MorganTech. Whose signature? Harold answered so quietly I almost didn't hear him. Yours. My heart stopped. That's impossible. I know. I've never signed anything like that. Which means someone has been forging your signature. And they've been doing it well enough that our auditors believed it was real. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Suddenly, Ryan firing me didn't matter anymore. Whoever had stolen $80 million hadn't just robbed the company. They had spent years building a trail of evidence that pointed directly at me. And if the board believed those documents were genuine, I wasn't just the founder of MorganTech anymore. I was the prime suspect. Harold agreed to meet me that evening at a quiet restaurant overlooking the marina. It was the same place where we'd celebrated MorganTech's 10th anniversary, back when life was much simpler. He looked exhausted when he arrived. Instead of ordering dinner, he placed a thick folder on the table and pushed it toward me. You need to see this before Thursday. I opened it and immediately recognized my signature at the bottom of the first page. It looked perfect. Every curve, every letter, every tiny detail was exactly the way I signed legal documents. I turned to the next page. Another signature. Then another. There were dozens of contracts approving consulting fees, software licenses, equipment purchases, and overseas partnerships. Together they accounted for nearly $80 million. I never signed any of these, I said quietly. Harold nodded, I know. That's why I had an independent handwriting expert examine them. I looked up. What did they find? He couldn't prove they were forged. My stomach tightened. Harold continued, he said whoever created them either had access to hundreds of your original signatures or watched you sign documents for years. I closed the folder. There weren't many people who had that kind of access. My executive assistant, the legal department, human resources, the finance office. Suddenly, the list of people I trusted didn't seem very long. Harold slid another document across the table. There's something else. It was a copy of an internal authorization log. Every fraudulent payment had been approved using an executive security code assigned to my office. I frowned. That code should have been disabled 5 years ago when I stepped down as CEO. Harold slowly shook his head. It wasn't. I stared at him. Who had access? That's what we're trying to find out. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from MorganTech's internal employee portal. My account, which had been inactive for years except for board access, had just been used to log into the company's network. Less than 2 minutes earlier, I looked at Harold. I'm sitting here with you. He stared at the screen, then immediately picked up his phone. Trace that login. Right now. After a few seconds, he listened silently before asking one question. Which office? His expression changed. You're certain? He ended the call and looked directly at me. Claire, I already knew something was wrong. The login came from your old executive office. I felt my pulse quicken. That's impossible. Harold nodded slowly. It would be. Unless someone is in there pretending to be you. The drive back to MorganTech took less than 15 minutes, but it felt much longer. Harold hadn't said another word after the call. He simply drove faster than usual, his eyes fixed on the road. By the time we reached the headquarters, 2 members of the board's audit committee were already waiting outside with the head of corporate security. None of them looked surprised to see me. They looked worried. Harold turned to the security director. Has anyone left the executive floor? The man shook his head. No. We locked the elevators as soon as we traced the login. We stepped inside and took a private elevator directly to the top floor. The hallway was silent. Most of the executive offices were empty, but the lights inside my old office were still on. Harold slowly pushed the door open. The room looked exactly the way I had left it 5 years earlier. The same walnut desk, the same paintings on the wall. Even the small crystal award from our first international client was sitting in the same place. But someone had been there recently. A laptop was open on the desk. My old executive account was still logged in. Beside the keyboard sat a cup of coffee that was still warm. Whoever had been using my office had left only moments before we arrived. Harold immediately called security. Lock every exit. Officers spread through the building while I walked around the office. Everything looked normal until I opened the bottom drawer of the desk. Inside was a folder I had never seen before. It contained copies of the same fraudulent contracts Harold had shown me at dinner, except these versions had handwritten notes in the margins. Payment dates, account numbers, instructions. Whoever created them had been working from my office because they wanted every piece of evidence to point toward me. Then I noticed one final sheet at the bottom of the folder. It wasn't a contract. It was tomorrow's board meeting agenda. Across the top, written in red ink, were 6 words that made my blood run cold. Asterisk asterisk Claire Morgan takes the blame. Asterisk asterisk I couldn't stop staring at the words written across the top of the page. Claire Morgan takes the blame. Someone hadn't just stolen $80 million. They had spent years building a case against me. Every forged signature, every fake approval, every payment routed through shell companies had one purpose: to make sure that when the fraud was finally discovered, the board would believe I had done it. Harold slowly took the paper from my hands. This was never about the money, he said. The money was only part of the plan. Before I could answer, one of the security officers rushed into the office. Mr. Bennett, you need to see this. We followed him into the executive conference room where the company's IT director had connected a laptop to the large screen. We've recovered deleted access logs, he explained. Whoever was using Claire's account didn't just log in today. They've been logging in every few weeks for almost 4 years. My heart sank. Can you see where? He nodded. Almost every login came from inside headquarters. Except one. He pressed another key. A map of California appeared on the screen. The final login had come from a luxury beach house in Newport Coast. Harold frowned. Who owns that property? The IT director looked down at another report. It's registered through a holding company. Who controls the holding company? The room became silent. Finally, the IT director looked up. Our chief financial officer. Nobody spoke. At that exact moment, the conference room doors opened, and Ryan Brooks walked inside carrying a tablet and a cup of coffee. He stopped the moment he saw me standing beside Harold. What's she doing here? He asked. I fired her yesterday. Harold slowly turned toward him. Sit down, Ryan. The young CEO looked confused but did as he was told. He noticed the financial reports spread across the table. What's going on? Harold folded his hands. For the last 4 years, someone has stolen nearly $80 million from MorganTech. Ryan's confident expression disappeared. What? Harold continued. And based on everything we've found today, your chief financial officer appears to be connected to the fraud. Ryan immediately shook his head. That's impossible. Daniel has worked here for 12 years. Harold looked directly into his eyes. So has Claire. Ryan frowned. Who? For a few seconds, nobody answered. Then Harold quietly pointed toward me. The woman you fired yesterday. Ryan looked at me, then back at Harold, waiting for someone to laugh. Nobody did. Harold's next sentence changed everything. Ryan. Meet Claire Morgan. She didn't just work here. She founded MorganTech. Ryan's face turned completely white. Ryan stared at me as if the room had suddenly stopped making sense. "You're the founder?" he asked quietly. I simply nodded. The confidence he had carried since his first day disappeared in seconds. He looked at Harold, hoping someone would tell him this was a joke, but nobody spoke. Harold slid a leather binder across the table. The original incorporation documents. Claire Morgan founded MorganTech 23 years ago. She still owns 35% of this company and has a permanent seat on the board. Ryan slowly opened the binder. Every page carried my signature, photographs from our first office, and records of the company's earliest investments. His hands began to shake. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Harold answered without emotion. "Because your job was to learn this company before making decisions. Instead, you started firing people on your first morning." Ryan lowered his head. "I made a mistake." "Yes," Harold replied. "But right now, that isn't our biggest problem." The conference room doors opened again. Daniel Foster, our chief financial officer, walked in carrying a stack of reports. He smiled confidently until he noticed everyone staring at him. "Did I miss something?" Harold gestured toward an empty chair. "Please sit down." Daniel looked around the room before taking his seat. Harold pushed the audit report across the table. "Would you like to explain why a holding company connected to your beach house received millions of dollars from MorganTech?" Daniel didn't even look at the documents. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Harold nodded toward the IT director. "Show him." A spreadsheet appeared on the screen listing dozens of payments, shell companies, offshore accounts, and property purchases. Every transaction eventually led back to the same holding company. Daniel's expression didn't change. "Those records are fake." Harold calmly placed another document on the table. "These came directly from our bank." Daniel finally looked down. For the first time since entering the room, he hesitated. Ryan looked back and forth between us, realizing the company he had inherited was nothing like he had imagined. Then one of the security officers entered without knocking. "Mr. Bennett," he said, breathing heavily. "We've got a problem." Harold stood immediately. "What happened?" The officer swallowed. Daniel's executive assistant just tried to leave the building carrying 6 storage drives and 2 boxes of financial records. Every eye in the room turned toward Daniel. He slowly leaned back in his chair, smiled for the first time that afternoon, and quietly said, "You're already too late." Daniel's smile didn't last long. Within seconds, 2 corporate security officers stepped into the conference room and quietly positioned themselves beside the door. Harold looked at Daniel without raising his voice. "You should know that your assistant never made it out of the building." Daniel's expression changed for the first time. "What?" Harold nodded toward the security director. "Everything she was carrying has been recovered. Every storage drive. Every financial record." Daniel looked down at the table for a moment before forcing another smile. "Even if that's true, you still can't prove I stole anything." Harold slid one final folder across the table. "Actually, we can." Daniel slowly opened it. Inside were signed statements from the forensic accountants, copies of bank transfers, surveillance photographs, property records, and a timeline connecting every shell company to accounts controlled by his holding corporation. The room remained silent as he turned each page. When he reached the last document, his hands stopped moving. It wasn't another financial report. It was a signed cooperation agreement from his own executive assistant. She had confessed everything less than an hour earlier. Every fake contract, every forged signature, every transfer, every meeting. She had also identified the one person who planned the entire operation. Daniel quietly closed the folder. "She talked." Harold nodded once. "She did." For the first time that day, Daniel stopped pretending. He leaned back in his chair and looked directly at me. "You know what the funny part is, Claire? None of this would have happened if you had stayed CEO. I didn't answer. The investors wanted growth. The board wanted bigger profits. Nobody noticed where the money was coming from because everyone was too busy celebrating quarterly results. Ryan looked stunned. You stole $80 million. Daniel shrugged. No. I borrowed it from people who never bothered to look. The silence was broken by Harold. Security. The two officers stepped forward. Daniel slowly stood up without resisting. Before leaving the room, he turned toward Ryan. One piece of advice. Ryan didn't respond. Never assume you know who the smartest person in the room is. Then he looked at me one last time. Especially when she's been quietly watching everything. The officers escorted him out, and the conference room door closed behind them. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Harold stood and looked around the table. We still have one item left on today's agenda. Ryan frowned. What item? Harold picked up the board agenda and read the final line aloud. ***, vote to confirm the future leadership of MorganTech. ***, Ryan slowly lowered his eyes. I understand, he said quietly. I'll submit my resignation. I looked at him for a long moment before speaking for the first time since the meeting began. No. Every head turned toward me. Ryan looked completely confused. What? I folded my hands on the table. You made a terrible first impression. You judged people before knowing them. And you fired the wrong employee. He nodded. I know. But you didn't steal from this company. He remained silent. I looked around the boardroom. The question isn't whether Ryan deserves another chance. I paused. The question is whether MorganTech deserves a leader who's finally willing to learn from his mistakes. Harold slowly smiled. The other board members began looking at one another. Then one by one, their hands started to rise for the final vote. Harold counted each vote before placing the final ballot on the table. A faint smile crossed his face. The motion passes. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment, then slowly stood. I understand, he said quietly. I'll submit my resignation before the end of the day. I looked at him across the conference table. Less than 48 hours earlier, he had ordered security to escort me out of the building. Now he stood waiting for my decision. Sit down, Ryan. He looked surprised. What? Sit down. He hesitated before taking his seat again. Every member of the board turned toward me. You made a serious mistake, I said. You judged people before learning who they were. You believed confidence was the same as leadership. And you fired the founder of this company without asking a single question. Ryan lowered his head. You're right. I nodded. But you didn't steal from MorganTech. You didn't forge my signature. And when the truth came out, you didn't try to hide from it. The room remained silent. Leadership isn't about never making mistakes, I continued. It's about having the character to admit them and the discipline to never repeat them. Harold leaned back in his chair, saying nothing. He already knew what I was about to do. Therefore, I said, I vote to keep Ryan Brooks as CEO under the supervision of the board. Ryan looked up in complete disbelief. After everything I did, why? I smiled faintly. Because 23 years ago, someone gave me a chance when I knew almost nothing about running a company. The difference is that I was willing to learn. I hope you are too. 6 months later, MorganTech had become stronger than ever. Daniel Foster pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and corporate theft. Federal investigators recovered most of the missing money through frozen accounts and seized properties. Every financial procedure inside the company was rebuilt, independent auditors reviewed every major transaction, and employees were encouraged to question decisions without fear of retaliation. Ryan changed more than anyone. He no longer made announcements from a stage. Instead, he spent his mornings walking through every department, listening far more than he spoke. One afternoon, he walked into my office carrying an old ceramic coffee mug with the faded MorganTech logo. "I found this in storage," he said. "I think it belongs on your desk." I smiled as I placed it exactly where it had always been. A week later, the company unveiled a new plaque in the main lobby. Employees gathered as Harold removed the black cloth. Engraved in polished steel were the words, **MorganTech, founded by Claire Morgan. **, for the first time in years, every employee knew the truth. As I looked around the lobby, I realized I had never really lost my company. I had simply been reminded that titles can be taken away, offices can be emptied, and names can be forgotten. But the person who built something from nothing can never have that history erased. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving your enemies wrong. It's reminding the world who you were long before they ever doubted you. **, the end. **.